Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. The mysterious women that buried Catherine Howard. Inside the walls of the Tower of London is a memorial that stands remembering those people who were executed on Tower Green. Near to the small patch of grass in front of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula was the site of the scaffold, the place where two of Henry VIII's queens were beheaded in brutal fashion. Anne Boleyn's execution was performed in front of a small-sized crowd of nobles, including Thomas Cromwell and the king's illegitimate son Henry Fitzroy, and was carried out by a French swordsman who was very skilled at the art of taking heads. But a number of years later, another one of Henry VIII's wives would make the short walk from her prison to the place where she would lose her head. The executions of Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, and his second wife, Anne Boleyn, are incomparable. Anne was given some mercy by the king, as her head was taken off by a swordsman, which was seen as much more reliable than the axe which would take Catherine Howard's head. Also, Anne's scaffold was draped in cloth showing that she was still a queen, but Catherine Howard was forced to kneel on the wooden scaffold, laying her head on the executioner's block in the hay to soak up her blood. Catherine Howard's execution, and subsequently what happened to her body, is regarded as a great tragedy, as the king literally attempted to wipe her off the face of the earth. But who was there in her final moments with her, and who were the women who allegedly buried her? Catherine Howard would be the most tragic wife of Henry VIII, and she would fall from grace very spectacularly. She married the notorious Tudor king on the 28th of July 1540 at Oatlands Palace in Surrey, just 19 days after the king had annulled his marriage to Anne of Cleves. Henry at the time was 49, and Catherine was between the ages of 15 and 19, and she was never really fit to become queen. She was far too young and naive. But for her family, they would have loved the fact that Catherine was now the queen, as the marriage would have brought them great wealth and land across England. However, Catherine would soon find herself implicated in rumours and scandal, as she was alleged to have had an affair with one of the king's closest male courtiers, Thomas Culpeper. It was said that Culpeper had succeeded the king in the queen's affections, and quickly Archbishop Thomas Cranmer sought to secure himself in the king's favour by investigating. It was he who told the king of his wife's illicit activities, and along with Culpeper, another man, Francis Derham, was executed on Tower Hill for their involvement with the queen. Things moved very quickly, and Henry VIII, ordering Catherine's imprisonment, and she was stripped of her title of queen on the 23rd of November 1541, before being taken to Sion Abbey, a convent. The heads of the men who she had allegedly been involved with were cut off and placed on spikes on London Bridge. But Catherine was held until Parliament produced an act of attainder against her, and this meant she could be put to death without any need for a trial. Following this, Catherine Howard was now a condemned woman, and she was taken down the River Thames on a barge into the Tower of London, the site of her execution and incarceration. On the 10th of February 1542, the flotilla went under London Bridge, and she saw the heads of her former lovers on a spike, and allegedly screamed. She was taken through the infamous Traitors' Gate, the water gate where treasonous individuals were brought into the tower to await their death. On the 13th of February 1542, Catherine's execution was arranged, and the organisation for this was carried out by Sir John Gage, the constable of the tower. It was his job to oversee the execution and also plan the arrangements, and it's likely that he would also have accompanied her on her final moments towards the executioner's scaffold. Now, Catherine would have been brought from her prison cell, which could have been the Queen's lodgings at the Tower, to the scaffold. She had previously the night before been practising laying her head on the block, and on the morning of her death she walked out in front of a crowd of councillors, lords, foreign advisers and ambassadors. It was said that when she arrived onto the scaffold, the Queen was so weak that she could hardly speak, but confessed in few words that she had merited 100 deaths for so offending the king, who had graciously treated her. She also asked all Christian people to take regard unto her worthy and just punishment with death, for her offences against God and heinously from her youth upward in breaking all of his commandments, and also against the king's royal majesty very dangerously. After speaking on the scaffold, Catherine knelt and lay her head on the block, and then an executioner with his sharp axe took her head clean off with one swift blow. Her blood ran onto the scaffold and was soaked up by the hay that had been placed onto the scaffold. But shortly after Catherine, her loyal lady-in-waiting Jane Boleyn was kneeling in the Queen's blood before her head was taken sharply off too. Now, the Queen's execution, it has been said that a number of Catherine Howard's ladies then collected her remains and corpse and then gathered it for burial. It was said that they covered her body with a black cloak and then carried it into the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where she was then buried. However, who were these women? It has remained rather mysterious who they were, and their identities are rather difficult to unearth. It's assumed that Catherine, during her short time inside the Tower, would possibly have had her ladies-in-waiting or maids of honour with her inside of her prison, but she may have also had these taken away from her when she was stripped of the title of being queen. She was not entitled to a royal funeral, royal household, or anything because of this, and this is a possibility. One woman she would remain with in her incarceration is Jane Boleyn, the woman who it's claimed facilitated and arranged the meetings between the Queen and Culpeper. It is, however, considered that Catherine was kept separately from Jane Boleyn. Interestingly, Jane, who died Lady Rochford, was of higher standing than the former Queen when she too was beheaded. It is interesting to consider that the stories of Catherine Howard being buried by her ladies may in fact not be true, as with Anne Boleyn's burial, she was granted her ladies to stay with her, and Catherine was also not kept inside the Tower for as long to have an established household. With Anne Boleyn's execution, Cromwell instilled a number of women to stay with Henry's second wife to try and collect evidence, but there was no need for this at all with Catherine Howard, as she was already indicted and sentenced to death. This opens up the possibility that Catherine was all alone inside of the Tower when she went to her death, and remained alone, only taking comfort from a priest who would have stayed with her in her final moments, and also the lieutenant of the Tower. But numerous accounts mention these mysterious women who collected the body of Catherine Howard and then placed her remains inside the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Now, taking the assumption that this is true, there are some possible women who could have stayed with her even in death. Firstly, as mentioned, is Jane Boleyn, but Catherine did have a large household during her short time as queen. One woman who was Catherine's maid of honour was Lucy Somerset, and she was mentioned in a letter by Eustace Chapuis, ambassador to the Holy Roman Emperor. Chapuis wrote to his master Charles V, the Emperor, that Lucy Somerset may have been considered to have become Henry VIII's sixth wife, as the king showed interest in her. It's clear that in 1542 Lucy Somerset had been close with Catherine Howard, and she could have been with her close by in her final days. She would later become a lady-in-waiting to Henry VIII's sixth wife, Catherine Parr. There were other women who were close with the Queen, including Anne Bassett and Margaret Garney, Margaret Coppledick, Damasin Stradin, and Margaret Folliot. However, nothing is concrete as to whether these women were allowed to stay with Catherine inside the Tower of London. There were also many great ladies who were involved in Catherine's household, and many of them had great foundations inside of the Tudor court, including Elizabeth Blount, Margaret Arundel, and Mary Howard. But it is not known if anyone went to visit Catherine either. What is interesting is that Henry ordered the great arrests of much of the Howard family also, and it could be possible that many of the Howard family members were inside the Tower as prisoners, whilst Catherine was being executed. However, despite the mystery surrounding Catherine Howard's burial, there is more evidence that alludes to the fact that possibly it was someone else, and not her ladies, that buried her. It could be considered that John Gage, the constable of the Tower, who was in charge of the execution, could have collected her remains and then oversaw her burial. Along with his wife, he could have collected the remains, and his wife, Philippa Guildford, could have then also seen Catherine in the Tower. With Anne Boleyn's execution, her body was collected in an oak chest which previously had housed bow staves before it was taken and buried in the chapel. But for Catherine Howard, there is no record of preparation. The accounts state again that her body was wrapped in a black velvet cloak, and then it's said that the women buried her inside the chapel. However, there were claims that her remains were then covered by a rather sparing and liberal amount of quicklime, and that this was shovelled into her grave. It's believed that King Henry VIII ordered this, and that the point was to dissolve the remains of Catherine Howard to practically nothing, as if she had never existed or even walked on the earth. The king wanted her erased from history, his memory and mind, and there is further evidence that supports this. During the renovations of the chapel, in the Victorian period, the remains of those buried were identified, including Anne Boleyn's body, Margaret Pole, and even Lady Rochford's body was identified, the woman who died straight after Catherine Howard. However, very little was left of Catherine. It is believed that she was buried close to the high altar in a prominent position, but her remains could not be found. The only possible bones belonging to Catherine were found close to Margaret Pole's remains, and a collection of bones were found which had been eroded by lime, and these were attributed to have been Catherine Howard's. What cast doubt onto the mysterious women who buried Catherine is the fact that her ladies would have wanted her commemorated and buried with honour inside of the chapel. They would not have covered her body with quicklime, and neither would they have had the tools to do this. It is unlikely that they were the ones who did this, and it's more likely that this was done by the Constable of the Tower on the orders of the king. With all of this, it's interesting to consider that Catherine Howard most probably could have gone to her death with no one supporting her, and that her ladies may have not even been inside the tower. This would mean that the stories of her being buried by her ladies are not true, and with the disposal of her remains inside of the chapel with quicklime, it adds further fuel to the fire that she was not buried with dignity in any manner by people who cared about her. With this, Catherine Howard can be considered one of the most tragic figures in the Tudor period, going to her death inside the Tower of London alone. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.